Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 188, The Art of Jewish Education. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Libenson.
And I'm Lex Rothberg.
And as we were working to put together this series on Jewish education, we started to ask people who was doing some of the most interesting work and some of the most interesting thinking in Jewish education. And the name of our guest today, Alicia Jo Rabins, kept coming up over and over again. Alicia Jo Rabins is primarily known as a musician, a singer, songwriter, a composer, a performer, but she also describes herself on her website as a Torah teacher, and she's described by others as a midrashist. We'll get into that later. And I think when you listen to this episode, you'll understand why people were so excited about her work. In addition to being a musician, Alicia Jo Rabins is a published poet with 2 collections of poetry that are out. As a musician and performer, she spent 8 years as the violinist for the klezmer rock band Golem, and she's also composed and recorded what is by now 3 albums of an indie folk song cycle about the complicated lives of biblical women. The albums are called Girls in Trouble, Half You, Half Me, and Open the Ground, and all of them are well worth a listen, which you can find at girlsintroublemusic.com, along with educational curricula that she has put together for each song. She's also written a chamber rock opera called A Kaddish for Bernie Madoff about the intersection of finance and spirituality, which is currently being made into an independent feature film. If that weren't enough, Alicia Jo Rabins is a Jewish educator, including a focus on DIY bar mitzvah tutoring. We're so excited to welcome Alicia Jo Rabins to Judaism Unbound for a conversation about the art of Jewish education. Alicia Jo Rabins, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thanks. I'm so happy to be here.
So you're described as a musician, educator, and midrashist, a creator of midrash, which is the idea of sort of stories that I guess we could call it a kind of Jewish fan fiction. You might have a better definition for it. I'm wondering how a person in our day becomes a midrashist.
Well, the story of my journey to that is that I grew up in a very secular Jewish home in a very non-Jewish suburb of Baltimore. So it wasn't one of those secular Jewish families surrounded by Jews. You know, it was like there was this thing about me that was different, and we didn't do Christmas and we did do Hanukkah, and I had a bat mitzvah, but there wasn't a whole lot of content that came with that. But I was always an artist. So I grew up very serious about writing poetry and playing violin and composing music. And that's what I studied in college. And I was also had a kind of, looking back, what I see as a spiritual hunger, which I didn't really realize there was more to Judaism than what I was seeing. So I looked for it in other places. And then when I went to college at Barnard, I met my first Orthodox Jews and realized that there were worlds of Judaism that I had not known existed. And for me, it was actually just, everything that I encounter in my life that feels meaningful, I pretty much kind of process through the lens of art. And so when I dove deep into Jewish texts and traditions and really fell just profoundly in love with them and went to Pardes in Jerusalem for 2 years to study at this pretty progressive co-ed yeshiva, I took with me my sort of artist lens of seeing the world. And so it was just sort of the most natural thing in the world to me that I would process what I was learning by making it my own and by making work about it. My favorite book in college and since then is Ulysses, which is essentially a modernist midrash on the Odyssey by James Joyce, where he kind of fuses it with his contemporary Irish identity, living in early 20th century Dublin. And so I was very familiar with that as a form of just interacting with the beloved, respected tradition and then translating it into what does this look like today in my life, in my body, in my world, in my community. So it just happened very naturally that I began to create, what our tradition calls midrash.
And I'm interested in and I've heard you describe falling in love with what you experienced at Pardes with the texts and the traditions in that way. But what's interesting in terms of the take that you have, and a lot of your songs are especially all your songs as part of the Girls in Trouble project, are voiced by biblical women. And it feels like when one encounters all of that material, and it's clear from the perspective of your songs that you're troubled by things that you see, or in many cases don't see in the text. And it's quite clear that if you think about biblical women, there actually aren't all that many. And the ones they are often called by their relation to the name of a man. And a lot of troubling things happen. And I'm wondering how you experience that dissonance between, on the one hand, falling in love, and on the other hand, being disturbed.
Well, I have a few different answers to that question. So one, just to make sure that if I refer to Girls in Trouble, to make sure that people know what that is, Girls in Trouble is a sort of midrashic music project that I've been doing for about 10 years that keeps growing and changing. And it's essentially a commentary on stories of women in the Torah and the central form of it is through these songs that began as my master's thesis in Jewish women's studies at JTS. And so I took a number of characters, women characters in the Torah, or girls, and I wrote songs in their voices from their perspective, often kind of indie folk style, sometimes a little more Americana, a little bit of klezmer. I took the stories and translated them into words and music in this kind of very contemporary way. And I've since kind of continued to work on that and built a curriculum around it. And there's a whole next theatrical step that's in the works right now. But so one thing I'll say in response to your question is that I assumed, as a not very educated Jew, who had never really read the Torah, I assumed that there would not be many female characters and that most of them would, like you said, just be like daughter of man or wife of this man. But I actually did not have that experience. When I started actually reading the text, I found that the women, they had different roles than the men, but they were really key and crucial players in the stories. I mean, they were not stories about a bunch of men interacting with like shadowy support female characters. The women were like making a lot of the huge plot twists happen. And so I actually came to feel that in a way it's less, I'm not trying to rewrite the Torah as a feminist text. Like that's not, it's not an apologetic kind of thing. But there are all these stories about women, and a lot of them don't have a lot of power and then find a way to get that power in the story itself. And so I began to feel that it was almost a failure or a weakness or a gap in the way that these stories were taught and passed down, as opposed to a weakness in the original text. I mean, there's plenty of problems with the text. I acknowledge that and I engage with that. But so I just kind of want to identify that, because I think a lot of times people just kind of accept the assumption that this is a book about men with some female support characters. And I don't find that to be true when you actually read the stories. So that's one thing. Another thing is that I imagined that the Torah would be full of kind of perfect people doing perfect things because it was a holy book. And I loved the complexity and the messiness of it and how it really reflected what I saw in my life and lives around me, and also what I loved about literature as an English major and a writer. It's not about glossing over the hard parts and kind of glorifying the good stuff. It's about the dark and the light. I mean, there's no good story without conflict, right? So the difficulties obviously are a huge engine in these stories. And now that I'm older, I feel like, okay, of course they wouldn't have been passed down for so long. I mean, humans need that for a good story. But when I was, 18, 19, just kind of thinking, well, the good book, I mean, I grew up in a very Christian environment. And so I had a sort of like Christianized perspective on the Bible as just like a source of good advice and information. So I was so delighted by the complexity and the complexity of character and the complexity of motivation that I expected. I'm a feminist. I was raised as a feminist. I went to a women's college. I expected to find a lot of patriarchy, and I did, but I was very pleasantly surprised by how much agency the women made for themselves if they weren't given it at the beginning of the story. By the end of the story, they often, certainly not always, but often had it. So in a way, writing these stories, I'm sort of keeping them company through their stories, but also really gratefully experiencing the sensation that they are keeping me company through my own challenges when I, read and spend time with their stories.
Let's talk about, you were just talking about complexity, and Dan in his question asked about like being disturbed, which I think is important. Let's hop for me, I don't want to speak for everybody or for you, but for me, one of the most challenging characters in the entire Bible, who I did not know about at all until late in college for a variety of reasons. Let's jump to the daughter of Yiftach, of the daughter of Jephthah. This is one of those characters that doesn't have her own name. She does have her own story. She does have a very interesting one. I don't want to frame too much. I just want to sort of give you the opportunity. Can you talk us through what you were looking to do in highlighting her story in your lesson and your song that highlights her, and maybe just sort of as an example of what you do with all of these women in the Bible, like how you sort of both accept the text and challenge it and bring up questions for students that are engaging with it. What does it look like to wrestle with the daughter of Jephthah through that Girls in Trouble lens?
Yeah. So I'm going to try to give a two sentence summary just so that this makes any sense if people aren't familiar with the story, because it is quite obscure. So essentially there's this warrior named Yiftach or Jephthah, and it's pretty clear that he's not the best guy in general. And it's a very violent moment of Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible, where there's a lot of wars happening. And so Jephthah goes into battle, and at a very dangerous moment, he makes this vow that if he is victorious, he will sacrifice the first creature he sees when he returns home. So parentheses, you're not supposed to make vows in the Torah. It's a very bad idea because you have to fulfill them no matter what. So there's a whole Jewish tradition around the importance of not making vows. So he does win the battle. He returns home. And what is the first creature that he sees? It's actually his daughter, who is coming out to greet him with tof umechol. So it's sort of drums and dance, which is actually the traditional ancient Near Eastern way of greeting returning victorious warriors. So he really should have known better. He falls to his knees and says, I've made this horrible vow, daughter. And she says to him, well, you can't escape that. A vow must be fulfilled. So just let me go with my friends for a little bit, a few weeks, a couple months, and then I'll come back. And then she did that, came back, and then the text says that he did as he had vowed. And there is ambiguity in the text. It's not 100% clear whether she was literally sacrificed or sort of sanctified as a nun for various reasons. And there's kind of different Jewish traditions have different ways of looking at that. But one thing I was really interested in and captivated by was, it's a very tragic story. It's a fascinating literary parallel to the story of the near sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis, with the notable difference that Isaac is rescued and she's not. This is later in the Hebrew Bible, so it's a time when God sort of intervenes a little bit less intensely than in Genesis, when God's really an active character. But what I was really fascinated by was her insistence on her father fulfilling his vow. And if the story didn't have her speaking and it just said, and then he returned and he saw her and he cried and he sacrificed her, I don't think I even would have written about it, because I'm not interested in like martyring women, But the fact that she, this, girl, steps up in this very twisted way and says, this is the rule. I'm going to first demonstrate that I have the capability of escape. And then I'm going to willingly demonstrate that I am willingly returning to submit myself to this. So I was just so fascinated by that. And the next step where my mind always goes is like, how does that show up in daily life? Obviously it's a myth, so it's kind of writ large and huge and tragic, but where are the ways that like an adolescent girl today might have the right and ability in our society to make certain choices, but she feels that she has to make this sort of self-sacrificing choice? That to me is like the central, crucial question. And that's why I see it as it's a very tragic story, but I think it's also a very powerful and relevant story if you just kind of do that midrashic step of transposing it from the exact details into more of like the categories and the forms of decision. So when I wrote my song in her voice, I wanted to kind of honor both the sadness. I didn't want to rewrite it into some cheerful thing, and the sort of anger that I feel reading the story, but also the kind of clear reading of like that she is part of this decision. And so it might be a larger social problem that she's manifesting, but this is not something that is simply done to her.
I want to hone in on the fact that you did write a song and that the song is a core component of this lesson in the curriculum, and of all the lessons in the curriculum, there's songs associated with each of the characters. And I want to highlight a couple of things. One, I feel like, so we, in this unit on education, we're interacting with people who, in certain senses, we might think of as sort of traditional Jewish educators, involved with whether it's a Jewish day school or a Jewish secondary school, Hebrew school, Sunday school. And I feel like if you're a listener and you're listening to this episode in conjunction with some of those, you could think, this is sort of like alt Jewish education. This is like an alternative way to go about this. Like maybe if that old school way or if those mainstream ways aren't working so well, you go this way. And I just want to name that because I want to push back on it. Because what you just chronicled in terms of, an in-depth look at this story with a variety, and in your lesson, you look at different rabbinic texts that play with this. You look at how Ashkenazi sources play with it, how Sephardi sources, it's really deep. And I don't want people to think, this is sort of the cute Jewish song curriculum. No, this is a deep dive. And so I guess that's the statement. The question is, what can we learn from that? How can educators out there listening or, former or current students listening consider what it would mean for music not to be sort of just the alt universe of education, but actually sort of centralized as a core modality of how we learn? Because I think so many of us can think about songs in our lives that just lodge themselves in our hearts and our memories, and we learn things from those songs.
Professors of education probably have better answers on, how and why to involve creativity in the classroom. I just feel like I'm called to it and it works. And I mean, I began when I came back from Pardes at age 23. My first job coming back was teaching what was called remedial Hebrew. So it was like 3rd and 4th grade Hebrew at a little Jewish day school in Western Mass. It was an incredible way to learn to teach. And then I moved on to teaching Jewish studies there. So for 2 years, I was in this tiny little, very heart-filled elementary school. And I'm so glad that my training as a teacher came with, 9 and 10 year olds. And occasionally I would be with the first graders or the kindergartners or the 5th graders. So, cause I think they just don't hide when they're bored and they don't hide when they're interested either. It's all very out there. And it's so clear to any teacher of little kids that when we engage, all the things that make it fun and flavorful to be human. So art, music, certainly visual art, film, movement, cooking, storytelling, debate. I think that art is one part of the excited synapses that happen when we're doing things that feel like play or that connect us emotionally. I mean, I think as an artist, I'm so interested in emotional connection. And so that's a huge thing that music just has the capability, because there's the words and then there's whatever it is that the magic of music to speak directly to human emotion beneath our intellectual selves. So I think it's sort of a combination of just like best practices as an educator, using diverse tools and bringing the world outside the classroom in and helping people see how it's connected. It's not just this old thing that you're like shoving down your throat. And then also engaging learners exactly where they are. And that's another thing that it's how I relate to these stories, and it's how I try to teach them and how I tried to frame it in the curriculum as well, is that they're not old stories that we're learning just for the sake of passing something on. They are actually medicine. It's sort of like I was saying with the women before, it's a little bit more of an uncovering of what's there as opposed to like a shoehorning in of like, let's make this innovative.
I have what I think is a pretty straightforward question, but I'm going to articulate it in a complex way because I'm trying to tease out a few thoughts as you're talking. I'm thinking about my daughter's bat mitzvah, which was a few months ago, and she gave her Dvar Torah, her little sermon, and it struck me as unusual because I'm used to a sermon trying to, in some way, give some kind of homiletic lesson and say, hey, there's a problem here, but I can solve it for you. And actually what I really appreciated about hers was she ended it by saying, basically, maybe God just made a mistake. And on the one hand, you could say she didn't really do what you're supposed to do. And on the other hand, I thought what she was really doing, intentionally or not, I'm not even 100% sure, was that she provoked the people in the room to see the story from a perspective that they may not have seen it. And she left it in their hands to decide what to do with it. And I'm just sort of thinking about you as a musician, as a songwriter, as an educator, and the combination of the two, and where they're the same and where they're different. Because I'm thinking, for example, take the song that Lex was talking about, or one of your other songs. If you actually listen to the song or read the lyrics, there's only a little bit of a twist to it, of a sense like, let me open up a perspective for you. You're not hitting people over the head with how you're thinking about it or they should think about it, and you're certainly not solving the difficulty for them. But then you've also created these educational packets that go along with the song that have a lot more materials that are also not there to hit you over the head, but that are giving you a lot more detail, a lot more of kind of what you might expect a little bit in kind of a curriculum or a book. And I'm wondering if you can kind of talk a little bit about how you expect, how you imagine, how you want people to interact with what you've created, those who are only listening to the song versus those who are taking the whole packet and the whole experience, and what the distinction is between the two. How do you think about those as an artist and as an educator?
From the very beginning, both because of my twin passions as an artist and as a Jewish educator, and also because of the constant artistic, problem of how to make a living and even how to just break even touring, not to mention make a living. From the beginning, it became clear that, playing in rock clubs as a new band starting out, I had been doing that for many years with many bands, and that's just not a very lucrative proposition until you get to a certain level. And many people don't, no matter how good you are, it's a little bit of a lottery, But then we would get these invitations because I was a Jewish educator from like a shul or a JCC would invite us to me with the band to come and perform the songs, but also do some kind of educational workshop separately or do storytelling about the songs in between the songs. Those paid more like a presenter fee, which was the kind of thing that could get us through a few nights of, I loved it in its own right because I am passionate about Jewish education, and it was great because they would sort of fly us down because that's part of how those performances work. And then we'd build a little rock club tour around that, sort of spending down whatever profit we would have made. And so from the beginning of Girls in Trouble's life in the world as a public project, it was a sort of 50-50 educational project in the Jewish community and just pure artistic project in the music community. So from the beginning, it was both. But also from the beginning, educators would come up to me at the Jewish gigs and say, like, how can I bring this into my classroom? Because I have this MP3 or this track on a CD, but that's not a lesson plan. And when I write the songs, because I'm not writing them primarily as educational vehicles, like you said, they're not like, then this happened, then this happened, they're not written to be that. So enough people asked me for educational material that's when I finally decided, I'm just going to apply for a grant to create this educational material to accompany the songs. And, the songs are sort of geared towards teens and adults. I want them to be able to explore the R-rated material in the Torah, which often doesn't get its due because we often, progressive communities, stop our education at 13, which is too young for that material. So many of the songs and many of the units can be used with younger learners, but they're intentionally not edited, for content in that way. And I really want people to use them how it works for them. My dearest hope for this curriculum is that it gives tools to go where they want with the material. So it has the original story. So they can read that and then listen to the songs with the lyrics. And it's got annotated lyrics in it so that if they want to know, okay, this line is my take on this midrash and this line is my take on this other midrash. And I decided to push the story in this way. And even though it's a little bit out of bounds for the original story, here's my justification. Like if you want to go deep in that kind of Talmudic way, I wanted people to be able to. But if they really just want the source text, or the source text and the midrashim that I'm referring to in the song, or each of them has an essay with where I'm like, where sort of what I was talking about before, like, here's where I translate this into modern life. Here's the human issue at the heart of this story. If that's what people are into, that's great. And then the last part of every unit is creative prompts. And it's up to educators or individuals whether they want to do it. But I'm so thrilled when people do, and then they send them in when they want to. There's a gallery on the webpage where people can share their own interpretations. Because to me, that is like the greatest sign of success of this is people making their own, often, very different from mine, interpretations of the songs. Because that means to me that they've found their own way of looking at it.
Gear shift time, segue time, awkward, but pretend that this was more fluid. We have been talking about your Girls in Trouble work, and you do a lot of things. There are other elements of what you're up to, and especially recently, you've been working on a film, Kaddish for Bernie Madoff, to specify, in a world where we talk a lot about Bernie Sanders.
Bernie Sanders.
But so Bernie Madoff, Kaddish for Bernie, is a film you're working on. And for me, what was brought up emotionally in watching the trailer was you named directly a question that is very live for me, which is, when does somebody cross a line when they're sort of not us? And I mean that both descriptively and prescriptively. So when do people cross a line where we don't want them to be part of us or part of various we's, W-E, that we are part of? And also, like, is there a situation where maybe they are still part of that we? Maybe, Bernie Madoff is Jewish. I'm also Jewish. Is there a descriptive we where somebody is still shared with me in a way that makes me uncomfortable when you're talking about one of the villains of our time? It just brought up a lot in me, and I wasn't ready for, I was watching this trailer just like not sure what it was about, and like, oh, casual question about the nature of what Jewish collective identity is and where we do and don't draw lines. Okay, talk to me about that. What's this film? What are you striving to achieve with it? And to the extent that you've got meditations on that question, what are they?
Yeah, so this film, it grows out of a solo show, a theater show that I toured for about 5 years. So this is a film adaptation of a theater piece. And the theater piece I created after I had an amazing residency when I was living in New York. During the financial collapse, I happened to be working on Wall Street because I had a residency from Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, which is a nonprofit in New York that gives unused real estate that kind of works with the real estate community to grant unrented floors of Lower Manhattan office buildings to artists. There was sort of this dilapidated, semi-abandoned floor of an office building. And along with about 20 other artists of different disciplines, I had a little office in it. And so I arrived there thinking I'll write my poems and I'll write my music and I'll ignore what's happening around me with Wall Street because it wasn't interesting, didn't feel relevant. And then the financial collapse happened. And because of that, Madoff's scam came to light. And it actually suddenly seemed like the most interesting thing or what was happening, right? I mean, I would look out my window and I would see people kind of carrying these boxes of papers down the street looking ashen because they'd just been fired. So the drama and that kind of pathos of it became very real for me. And as soon as the Madoff thing happened, I just got very interested in, he's from such a different Jewish community from the sort of like grassroots, creative, educational Brooklyn community that I was working in. But I soon began to realize that I had a lot of connections to people who were connected to him in some way. So I was interested in, what does it mean that he's a Jew? What does it mean that he's kind of part of my community, kind of not? Should we have some kind of, we don't have a mechanism in modern Judaism, modern progressive Judaism, for saying you are no longer one of us if you cross this line. And is that a good thing? Or should we? I mean, is there no limit on what someone from the community can do, especially if they don't seem fully repentant? And sort of these two poles of like, there's the sort of, there's a Kabbalistic idea that there's sort of overflowing loving kindness and compassion, and it's balanced metaphysically by judgment and boundaries, sort of like yes and no, in the simplest language. And so, the compassion side is like, well, who knows what I would have done in his, with his parents and his situation, and who knows what any of us would have done. and also the sort of mystical idea that we're all connected. There's no way to separate ourselves, like it or not just all Jews, but all humans. Everything is part of like an interconnected pulsing web of energy. And you can't just draw this line. That's one side. The other side is like, no, if we're going to have a community, that means some people are in the community, some people aren't. That's the definition of community. And if we don't have a mechanism for moving someone out of the community, if they've transgressed something that's like it's so incredibly major and don't seem capable of true repentance, does that mean we have to kind of claim him if we don't have that? Is there no way to separate? So the show is sort of it's like very serious and very silly at the same time. And it's I wrote songs based on my interviews with different people. So I sort of become the FBI agent talking about what he saw on the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building. And I become this lawyer for some of the victims who are being sued for their profits. But then I also bring like Kabbalistic texts and Buddhist texts and try to consider these deep ideas. And the last thing I'll say is that so many people assume, including myself, assume that his returns were very high. And so it was greed that inspired people to invest with him. And so there's this sense of like, well, you got what was coming to you because you overlooked these impossibly high returns. But the truth is that they were just matching the market average. So they were no higher than the average of the market. The difference was that they went up in a straight line. So instead of like the zigzag that you see in that stock market pattern, where people who are into stocks, sort of their stomach drops when it drops, right? Because it's like suddenly you have a lot less money, and then you get happy when it's higher. So he just promised, what he promised was not impossibly high returns, but impossibly regular returns. And I couldn't help but see that as a metaphor for the way that all of us sort of long for this life that goes forward, and we don't have failure, and we don't have illness, and we don't have tragedy, and we don't have struggles. It's just like kind of every day is smooth, and we get what we want, and maybe it's a little hard, but generally everything's kind of fine all the time. And that's just not what it means to be alive.
So Lex dug up a piece that you wrote on why you're not a rabbi that I think is relevant in this context. It's something that I think about a lot too, and I think Lex thinks about it a lot from the other direction.
I do.
I don't want to put this in your mouth, Lex, because I think this is a dichotomy that I've set up, but I think that you are into it as well. But I've set up a dichotomy between a rabbi and an artist, and I'm curious how you respond to it as an artist who is sometimes considered, or people have suggested, to be a rabbi. To me, I think that the distinction that I'm trying to make is that a rabbi is authorized. A rabbi has gotten some kind of authorization from some larger body to say, you have some kind of position where, in different ways, to different extents, people should listen to you. Whereas an artist is not authorized by anyone. Sometimes they could go to school, but basically an artist is not authorized. And an artist is someone who says, I've got something here. Well, how does it land on you? The power is in your hands. If you don't like it, then I failed as an artist, or, maybe in my mind I didn't fail, but bottom line, it's not working. And that's okay, because that's what it means to be an artist. And I want to connect that a little bit to this question that you talked about with Bernie Madoff about the smooth ride versus the ups and downs, because it feels like we're at a point in Jewish history where we could use some artists, where we could use some people who are remixing this stuff and experimenting and trying to find something that's really going to work better than what we have. And yet I understand the reluctance of people, of funders, of others to say, but that's a really dangerous path to go down. I mean, what if it doesn't work? And I think it might not work, as opposed to the path that we're on, which is kind of definitely not working, but it's not working pretty slowly, or the ride down is kind of slow. So I'm curious to hear your response to that, to my setting up that dichotomy, and how you experience it as both an artist and a pseudo rabbi type that is not authorized.
I'm not really a provocateur. That's just not my goal. I want to provoke emotional responses, but in terms of like genuine personal feelings, like I love it when people have a deep personal response and feeling to what I'm doing, but I'm just not interested in intentionally kind of dafka or intentionally pissing people off. And I obviously have this deep respect for the tradition. So I thought about going to rabbinical school. And it was clear that I was going to be, I was sort of acting as a like de facto rabbi for my friends and community. And as someone who didn't grow up really in the Jewish community, I feel very at home sort of like rabbiing to Jews on the fringe, who maybe have very little Jewish education or a traumatic Jewish past, or, and for whatever reason, they want something that does not feel institutional. And that is like exactly that's who I am. So I was like, well, clearly I'm playing a rabbinic role. So maybe I should just go to rabbinical school. And I really meditated on it. And I just came to the conclusion that I didn't want that responsibility of speaking. I felt like, if you become a communal leader, you have certain privilege and responsibility of speaking for the community, right? So when you're a clergy, you're representing the community. And I felt like I can always be an educator. Judaism is fortunately very generous with like lay officiation. I can facilitate these experiences without being a rabbi, but I can't be a fearless artist if I am a rabbi, because I just don't want to like step on people's toes. And I want to be able to be fearless as an artist, because I'm not afraid of offending people as an artist. But as a rabbi, I would be very afraid of offending people, because I feel like there is this grave responsibility of you're representing them, right? On the other hand, I also sort of identify as a priestess. A couple of years ago, I was really doing some like deep meditation on like, I'm a musician, I'm a poet, I'm a Jewish educator, I'm a performer. What holds all these things together? Because to me, they all feel like the same thing, but people always laugh when they read my bio because it sounds ridiculous. It's like, it doesn't feel funny, So I finally realized that, that it's all priestess work to me. It's all facilitating a connection with tradition, a connection with each other, a sort of coming to understand more the feelings inside us and experiences inside us, which are sometimes hard to name or which it's easier to look away from. So bringing people in, hopefully in contact, helping name those experiences and parts of themselves. And so whether I'm doing it through teaching a 12-year-old Torah and sitting with them and just speaking very directly about like, what do you think about God? Like, are you into it? Are you not? Like, what are your questions? Or whether I'm performing Girls in Trouble or other music, or, making a film about Bernie Madoff, which is really ultimately a film about what it means to be human and how to kind of navigate that. To me, that is all like, I just think of the first piece of writing in human history where we know the named author is a hymn to a goddess by a priestess and Hedwana in ancient Sumer. So it used to be that poetry, song, and spiritual leadership were one, and like, ancient Greek theater, that kind of thing. Now we like to separate everything out and say, well, how can you teach kids the Torah and, go on tour as a musician? But really it's just, facilitating these questions. And so that's sort of my answer. And I felt like in order to have the fullness of that spectrum, it was just so much easier to not be called a rabbi.
We're arcing towards the end of the episode a little bit. We still got a little bit of conversation left, but I want to make sure we slip this in because you, as far as I can remember, are one of the only people we've had on the show who both identifies as an artist and as a Jewish educator. And I guess because of that, I'm sort of like jonesing, like, what's something that you can just teach us, wearing a little bit of your educator hat, about the relationship between Judaism and art? We spend so much of our show talking about those two things. What are we missing? What's something that you could help us reconceptualize before we end this conversation on that front?
The Torah is it's a book, it's a piece of literature, and literature is just, an isolated category of really art. I mean, really, it's also a song. It's got trope in it, it's meant to be chanted and sung. It's storytelling. It's like, that's what film does. So text itself is art, and that is at the core of our tradition. And so artists who are working in Jewish modes are not sort of a fringe element, but are, taking up the mantle of what the rabbis did, right? And writing midrash, continuing to be creative, to sort of be on that creative vein of like, what is the creativity of our moment demanding? Like the rabbis were taking in stories that were already ancient to them and sort of retelling them or adding on or interpreting in a way that made sense with their own culture. And if you look at midrash, it really obviously reflects the culture of where each rabbi is. It's not like one homogeneous thing. It's like this guy's writing in Egypt in this century, and this person's writing in France in this century, and they're going to have a really different vibe, and they're going to have different concerns, and you can tell that in what they choose to write about in the narrative midrash and also the legal midrash. And so I think in a way, I do see myself, I hope it's not self-aggrandizing, to see myself and all of my fellow contemporary Jewish artists in that tradition, not just in the limited, like, oh, it's contemporary midrash, but like it's one element of the generative lifeblood of creating what it is to be alive and Jewish at this moment.
We haven't talked about like Sunday schools or classrooms, or like in this unit, we are approaching all sorts of those kinds of questions about the practical X's and O's, to use a sports analogy, of Jewish education. What would you offer up as sort of a practical tip or set of tips for how to like allow these ideas to shift what happens in a classroom, in a setting of Jewish education? Like in your dream Jewish world of 50 years from now or 100 years from now or however long from now, what would be different? Like what would change about the world that we currently have in a future that embodies the values that you'd like Judaism to embody?
I mean, what I actually think about is there is such a human desire to like pass down what we know by talking about it and then talking about it more, and then making sure that they understood what we said about it, as opposed to taking a little chunk and being like, here, go crazy with this, like, what does this make you do? Or what do you think about this? Or how would you argue with this? I think that as an educator, like engaging people's resistance is such a powerful tool. Like I get excited whenever I feel a student or participant start kind of going off about like, well, I don't like God. I'm like, great, let's talk about that. Because that's a legitimate emotional connection. I'm like, yes, we're getting somewhere now, and if you just kind of gently, compassionately walk into that, that's where the real conversation starts happening. So I think, my main answer is just something about not feeling this obligation to pass on the whole tradition, but instead to take, I am a content person, actually. I'm not say something and then, but what they create is more important. It's more like give them a true nugget of something that feels so essential and maybe problematic. It doesn't have to be just the good stuff, but a real little nugget where they are directly interacting with the tradition without your interpretation, and then let them take it to the next step and see where that conversation goes.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much for listening.
And thanks from us to all of you for listening as well. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We want to close out this episode in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. But before we do, we want to quick mention that, of course, Elul, the month of Elul, is still upon us. We've got a little bit left in the month before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur hit, and we hope that those of you who have been with us for the daily emails for Elul Unbound have been enjoying it. Please let us know how that's been going for you at Elul, E-L-U-L, at JudaismUnbound.com. We love hearing what people are trying out with their own practices, what's resonating from us that you've liked, what you'd change for the future. All of that is good. Just send us an email. The other ways that you can be in touch with us are, of course, that you can go to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound, that you can go to our Twitter feed at Judaism Unbound, that you can go to our website at JudaismUnbound.com, and that you can email us also. There's the Elul one, but for general things, you can email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last request we'd like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial support that you can allocate and send our way, and you can do that at JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.